today's webinar titled How Climate Change Threatens the Utility Sector and How We Create Resilience. My name is Erin Cameron, and I'm the Development and Outreach Coordinator for Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Before we get started today, I'd like to just take a moment to review the basic functions of the control panel on your screen. If you'd like to minimize your panel, just select the orange arrow in the left-hand corner and then select the arrow again to display the panel. To ensure sound quality, all of the attendee lines will be muted throughout this presentation, but we encourage you to please type in any questions you may have in the questions box on your control panel. We will then answer the questions at the very end of the presentation today. For those of you not familiar with Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we are a regional organization focused on promoting responsible energy choices that create global warming solutions and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We are a membership organization, and I would like to acknowledge our members on this call and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website listed here on this slide, cleanenergy.org. And now to lead us through the presentations today, I'm going to turn it over to Ula Reeves, State's High Risk Energy Program Director.
Great, thank you, Erin. And I'd like to introduce you first to Steve Klimmer, who is presenting today on the Union of Concerned Scientists' new report called Power Failure. And I'd like to thank the Union of Concerned Scientists for being a great partner with us on many issues over the years. They always bring excellent research, resources, and ideas, many of which are very applicable and timely for us here in the Southeast, and this new report is no different in that regard. Steve is the Director of Energy Research for the Union of Concerned Scientists in the Climate and Energy Program. Steve directs the organization's research on coal, natural gas, and nuclear power, and on solutions to reduce carbon emissions and water use in the electricity sector. Before joining UCS, Steve was the Energy Policy Coordinator for the Wisconsin Energy Office, and Steve holds a Master's in Energy Analysis and Policy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Steve, please take it away.
Thanks, Ula. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, looks great.
Yep.
Presentation's up? Okay, good. Yeah, so as Ula said, today I'm going to talk about a report we released this past April called Power Failure. And the report is really about the growing vulnerability of our electricity grid to power outages due to extreme weather and climate change, and how we can make the grid more resilient, reliable, and low carbon. Hurricane Sandy really put a spotlight on this issue as more than 8 million customers across 21 states lost power, had no heat for their homes, couldn't put gas in their cars, schools were closed, and hospitals struggled to treat patients. When people lose power due to extreme weather, they typically don't associate it with climate change. So our goal with this report was to bring attention to this issue and to highlight some of the smart energy choices that can be made to make the power sector more resilient in the face of the changes we're seeing today, at the same time reducing the emissions and long-term costs linked to global warming. This slide shows that the frequency, severity, and cost of extreme weather events has been steadily growing over the past few decades. The average cost of severe weather events has risen from about $20 billion per year in 1980 to $85 billion per year in the 2010s. In just 2011 and 2012 alone, 25 extreme weather events caused an estimated $188 billion in damages and resulted in 1,100 fatalities. Our nation's electricity system is vulnerable to these risks, ranging from the power plants that generate the electricity to the distribution and transmission lines that deliver the electricity to consumers. Making matters even worse, America's electricity system is old and outdated. It was built for the climate of the past, not the climate of the future. For example, the American Society of Civil Engineers gives our electricity infrastructure a grade of D+ for its poor condition. All of this adds up to an electricity system that's highly vulnerable and more likely to cause outages when extreme weather hits. And these risks are growing due to climate change. And they're like projections show that these the impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise, wildfires, heat waves, and droughts, are likely to become more severe and more intense, more frequent in the coming decades. The electricity sector really has a vital role to play in solving this problem. As you can see in the pie chart to the left, the electricity sector is responsible for about nearly 40% of energy-related carbon dioxide emissions in the U.S., more than any other sector. The electricity sector not only needs to adapt to the changes we're experiencing, but it also needs to curb the costs and impacts related to the, climate change in the future. Sea level rise is one of the 4 major climate-related risks that we highlighted in the report that threatens our electricity infrastructure. This vulnerability, as I mentioned before, was exposed during Hurricane Sandy when 7,000 transformers and over 15,000 electrical poles were damaged, leaving those 8 million customers without power for days and even weeks. The picture in this slide shows the flood damage that happened from storm surge during Hurricane Sandy in 2012. And this photo is from New Jersey, I believe, up in the Northeast. But other hurricanes like Rita and Irene have caused problems like this in the Southeast, as many of you probably are familiar with. Rising sea levels can make storms and coastal floodings more harmful by allowing more water to reach further inland. This map shows that much of the electricity infrastructure is along the coast. This map has over 100 electrical facilities. Most of them are power plants that are within 4 feet of high tide. This is a map that comes from Climate Central, who put out a report on this recently. And as you can see, many of these facilities are located in the southeast, particularly the low-lying coastal areas of Florida. Scientists predict that sea levels will rise between 1.6 and 6.6 feet above 1992 levels by the end of the century, which will dramatically increase the amount of infrastructure that's vulnerable to coastal flooding and storm surge. Water-related risks are also a major threat to the electricity sector. Thermal power plants rely on water to condense steam that drives the turbines of power plants and generates electricity. When the water is either too hot or too scarce, power plants can be forced either to curtail production or to shut down entirely, putting electricity customers at risk of outages. If water temperatures are too high, it can also reduce the plant's efficiency or cause unsafe conditions. Power plants can also run up against temperature discharge limits, which are set to protect ecosystems. And when there's not enough water, power plants simply can't operate because the condensation process is vital to driving the turbines. This figure shows and makes it clear that power plants have been experiencing water stress for the last several years. It gives many examples, particularly at coal and nuclear plants. And these water-related risks are likely to get even worse as drought and heat waves become more common with climate change. Ula is going to talk in her presentation about some of the problems that have occurred at specific plants in the southeast. So I'm gonna move on. We did complete a different study in 2013 called Water Smart Power that used electricity and water models to look at what was going on at a more local level under different low carbon scenarios in the future. For example, we were interested in looking at the pressure on reservoirs or aquifers or on river flows or river temperatures under hotter and drier conditions in the future. For water temperatures, for example, we looked at how often temperatures would be above the ecologically important threshold of 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This shows a region in the southeast, a water basin in the southeast where we analyze these impacts. And what we found was that under a business as usual scenario, temperatures on the Coosa River on the Alabama-Georgia border, the incidence of days over that threshold level I was talking about would triple over the next coming decades to an average of 18 days per year in the 2040 to 2049 timeframe. In contrast, under a high renewables and efficiency scenario that included retirements of upstream power plants, river temperatures would actually be 3 to 13 degrees Fahrenheit cooler in the summer and stay below that 90-degree threshold that I talked about. Another climate-related risk to power plants is the increase in the most extreme precipitation events, which can cause flooding. As many of you are aware, the Fukushima disaster in Japan was a result of a large nuclear power plant being flooded for different reasons due to a tsunami and an earthquake, but the results of that flooding caused massive damage to the nuclear reactors. And this picture shows that a similar phenomenon, although it was caused by inland flooding, occurred at the Fort Calhoun nuclear power plant in Nebraska, which was closed in April 2011 due to record flooding on the Missouri River. The plant suffered significant damage from that event and needed lengthy repairs. The plant didn't open for about 2.5 years. Finally, in December 2013, it restarted. Climate change will also bring more intense and more frequent heat waves to North America, which will have negative consequences for the power sector. Electrical equipment is much less efficient at higher temperatures, not only power plants, but transmission and distribution lines as well. When it's hot outside, they all get are less efficient. By 2040, water temperatures in the U.S. are estimated to be 1.3 to 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit higher than today, which will lead to a 12 to 16% decrease in power plant efficiency. This is compounded by the fact that electricity demand rises during the summer and when people turn on their air conditioners to stay cool. A study that was done in California estimated that electricity demand could increase by as much as 21% on especially hot days by the end of the century. So that will only exacerbate problems. The extraction, processing, and distribution of fossil fuels entails many steps that are also vulnerable to the effects of extreme weather and climate change that in turn can disrupt electricity supplies. This map shows how recent hurricanes have impacted coastal energy infrastructure. Sea level rise and storm surge from hurricanes can disrupt both offshore facilities as well as coastal natural gas wells and processing facilities, as we saw from Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Inland flooding can also disrupt the transportation of coal by rail and barge, as well as disrupt coal supplies. This map on the left shows coal shipment routes that cross major rivers in the U.S. that are vulnerable to flooding. And the picture at the lower right shows another potential problem from flooding, which is the waste that's generated from coal plants. The coal ash and toxic waste that's left over can also find its way into the environment. This is a picture of the Kingston, Tennessee ash spill that happened a few years ago that many of you are probably familiar with. To ensure a reliable and affordable power supply for the decades to come, the electricity sector needs to become more resilient in the face of these changes and also adapt to the growing risks. The typical response that we see by utilities to extreme weather events is to invest in so-called hardening measures. As shown in these pictures, this includes things like burying power lines underground, building protective seawalls, elevating or relocating important equipment like substations, and tree trimming. Many homeowners and businesses have also installed diesel generators to provide backup power during outages. However, these systems also produce carbon and other harmful emissions, making them a less attractive option. While some level of hardening is certainly necessary, these measures are often expensive and may not be the most cost-effective long-term solution. I just wanted to highlight one study that was done in 2011 by Entergy for the Southeast, and they estimated that it would cost at least $15 billion over a 20-year period by 2030 to harden the electric utility systems along the Gulf Coast. They also found that all of the potentially attractive measures to protect the company's energy infrastructure would cost about $120 billion over that time frame. However, they also found that that investment could avoid about $200 billion in estimated losses that would have occurred without those investments. The other thing I just wanted to highlight is utility plans rarely acknowledge the connection between extreme weather and climate change, and rarely propose investments in long-term solutions that really are needed to reduce emissions and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So that leads us to another angle of this report where we emphasize energy choices that can play a vital role in both improving the resilience of the system and at the same time reducing global warming emissions. And energy efficiency is one of the best options for that. It's the fastest and cheapest way to reduce emissions while saving consumers money on their electricity bills. It can also defer or eliminate the need to build new power plants and other infrastructure. Having less infrastructure means that there's less equipment that's vulnerable to those climate-related risks I described earlier. Energy efficiency products like the Energy Star window shown in the upper right have saved Americans about $26 billion on their electricity bills and have saved the equivalent electricity of about 35 million homes. 35 million homes. And pictures on the left show sustainably designed buildings can also help both reduce emissions, but they can also help reduce the need for cooling in the summer months. And energy efficiency can also make those buildings more comfortable for longer periods of time during power outages. Another solution that many cities have looked at are green and cool roofs that can also add a layer of resiliency while reducing emissions. The ones shown in this picture from places like New York City, Washington, D.C., and Chicago have helped reduce the urban heat island effect that adds to the problem in urban areas, while reducing the need for air conditioning and making the buildings more comfortable. At the same time, it's helping to improve urban air quality. An NRDC study found that installing green or cool roofs on 50% of the buildings in Southern California could reduce energy bills by $210 million per year and cut carbon emissions by over 400,000 metric tons annually. These are just a couple of examples of actions that leading cities are taking to adapt to climate change while reducing emissions. Renewables can also be win-win solutions that make the electricity grid more resilient and reliable while reducing carbon emissions. Renewable technologies tend to be smaller and more distributed, which make the grid more flexible. In contrast, large coal and nuclear plants can make the grid vulnerable when they go offline, and grid operators have to keep large amounts of reserve capacity available to replace the generation from those large plants. And when a plant is down, repairs can often take days or weeks before a plant can come back online. Several renewable technologies like wind and solar PV also do not depend on water to produce electricity, which is a huge advantage in a warming world. Renewable energy is also far less vulnerable to interruptions in the fuel supplies stemming from extreme weather, as I discussed earlier. For example, extracting fossil fuels, such as what we're seeing with the recent shale and oil gas boom, often requires freshwater resources, which are likely to become less available in certain parts of the country in a warming world. Renewables, also, there's lots of examples that we try to highlight in the report, sort of case studies of where renewables have done a better job withstanding recent storms and their fossil and nuclear counterparts. For example, in the summer of 2011, Texas suffered a record-breaking heat wave, forcing many coal and natural gas power plants to shut down. During that time, wind power made a significant contribution to the electricity system for several days, helping to keep the lights on while easing pressure on water supplies during one of the state's worst droughts. After Hurricane Sandy, several power plants were damaged, causing widespread outages. But most wind turbines, like the ones in Atlantic City that are shown in the bottom right-hand corner, and solar panels, didn't suffer any damage during the hurricane and were available to produce power after the storm had passed. After Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, there was a program called Make It Right that was attempted to help rebuild some of the city's homes with solar panels and energy efficiency measures. There's an example of that in the upper right. In the future, sort of a potential game changer is to install solar with battery storage systems, rooftop systems, instead of using backup diesel generators, combining that with building zero-energy homes to maximize the amount of energy efficiency. And that could really have a huge impact in helping both to reduce outages, potentially allowing customers to disconnect from their utilities and the grid entirely. Sorry for the delay. There's a couple of transitional issues here. So once again, going back to our Water Smart Power study, it showed that under a high renewables and efficiency scenario, the Southeast could significantly reduce both water use and carbon emissions compared to a business's usual scenario that relied heavily on natural gas to meet future electricity needs. This chart shows the projected change in power plant water withdrawals in the Southeast on the left and the change in water consumption on the right under those scenarios. The change in water consumption on the right was much greater than the change in water withdrawals, primarily because we assumed that cooling systems would transition over time from once-through cooling to recirculating systems. And those recirculating systems significantly reduce withdrawals but increase consumption. Moving on, like many fossil fuel and nuclear power plants, renewable technologies such as wind and large-scale solar projects are often sited from large cities and will require transmission lines to deliver power to consumers. If the grid does go down because of extreme weather, delivering power from any facility is really challenging. However, as noted earlier, our nation's electricity infrastructure is in need of repairs and upgrades. Advances in grid technology and new transmission lines will make the grid more flexible and resilient while allowing it to integrate more renewable energy. We also talk about briefly in the report, many of you have probably heard the buzz around smart grids or microgrids as potential solutions to help prevent or reduce the severity of outages. With the exception of smart meters, most people don't really know what smart grids are. As this graphic illustrates, they really represent a family of technologies, advanced electronic and communication technologies, including things like sensors, processors, distributed generation, storage, and demand-side management. All of these things working together can help control and isolate disturbances on the transmission and distribution system, which can help reduce the impact of power outage and reduce power outages. Finally, I just wanted to leave you with the report ends with some recommendations for how we can make the electricity system more resilient to climate change. This includes things like vulnerability assessments, which are really needed to help understand the risks and vulnerabilities. Some cities, some states have done these assessments. There's some good models out there. The utility industry also needs to do this type of assessment to better understand the risks. It's also important to invest in climate resilience. Federal and state governments and private institutions should work together to identify resources and invest in technologies and other measures to make the electricity sector more resilient while reducing the impact of climate change. It's also important that these initiatives get reflected into utility planning, since utility investments are really can be around for a long time. It's important to incorporate resilience to climate change as well as technologies that will reduce emissions. I also just jumping down, obviously the Southeast could do a lot more in terms of adopting stronger state clean energy policies, both for efficiency and renewables. Most states in the Southeast are lacking other parts of the country on that front, and trying to get those in place would help make tremendous progress to achieving these objectives and reducing the impacts of climate change. Finally, I just wanted to highlight the enacting stronger carbon standards. As many of you know, the Environmental Protection Agency recently put out a proposal to reduce power plant carbon emissions from existing plants. They also have one from for new power plants. And their proposed approach, on a positive note, their proposed approach would allow states to use renewables and efficiency investments to help comply with these standards. Both states and UCS are working on this issue. There is a comment period happening right now that comments are due in mid-October for EPA's proposal, and we would encourage people to submit comments to both strengthen the targets that they've adopted at the state level to achieve deeper emission cuts, but also to recommend using greater investments in efficiency and renewables to achieve those cuts. And if you can follow up either with SACE or UCS on that, and we'd be happy to provide more information. So I'll end there and pass it over to Ula. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Steve. I think we're got the screen switched over here. So I wanted to take a few of, there are some slide repetitions here, so we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the Southeast with looking at some of the specific examples of power plants that have been impacted by changing water conditions, specifically over the past few years. In the Southeast, we get the majority of our power from very large power plants, primarily coal and nuclear. And these are located on nearly every waterway in the region and are littered across every single state in the Southeast. These power plants, as Steve mentioned, are typically very heavily water dependent, particularly in the Southeast, where we have traditionally a lot of water availability. And because they are large single source power generators, when something affects their ability to produce power, it literally affects hundreds of thousands of people in several different ways. And Steve has mentioned some of those, and I'll mention some other issues. In the Southeast, we have 73 current operating coal plants, and we have 15 nuclear power plants. So you can see the sheer numbers, and we have seen a number of coal retirements across the region over the last several years, but we still are extremely dependent on these very large facilities. Across the nation, power plants withdraw on the order of 100 billion gallons a day of fresh water, and that represents more than 40% of the U.S. total water withdrawals. So why does it matter that power plants are so thirsty? Well, this map shows that by the middle of the 21st century, periods of severe drought are expected to be substantially longer than those in the 20th century. The 2012 drought that we had in this country covered 60% of the United States, and the drought in 2007 here in the Southeast affected nearly all of our states, and many of the examples are from 2007. And again, typically people think of the Southeast as being very water rich, but the climate change models indicate that our region is likely to suffer from increases in drought and high temperature situations in the future, and this will increasingly lead to less certainty and predictability about the water resource availability. So this issue of resilience and needing a more flexible grid and energy infrastructure is, I think, very, very critical for us to be thinking about in the region. You can't cool a power plant with no water or hot water. And again, as Steve mentioned, even just warm water can decrease a power plant's efficiency, and that makes the facility uncompetitive and expensive for us, the consumers who pay our bills. And we're not the only ones who are concerned. While the utilities might not admit to climate change being a driver, there are efforts underway to increase power plant water use efficiency, and one of those examples is from Georgia at Georgia Power's Water Research Center, and this article from yesterday talks about that, and you can see here a snippet that I pulled is that the very large coal plant, Georgia Power's Plant Bowen, uses 30,000 gallons of water to operate. And that's a lot of water. So awareness is increasing, not really quickly enough, but it is reassuring to see that we are starting to make better connections in the region about the water and energy nexus and potential problems. Okay, so this is one of the repeat slides. It's not really showing up correctly there, is it? I apologize. I don't think that's showing up correctly on the view for all of you. Yeah. So, well, I'll just go through the examples, and I don't know if we might be able to get it fixed, but I was attempting to zoom in on the map that Steve had shown with some of those specific examples over the past several years where a number of power plants in our region experienced hardships from hot water issues and issues of not enough water. The 2007 drought revealed numerous locations, specifically in North Carolina and Virginia on the upper reaches of the Dan River. Duke Energy reported releasing cooling water back into the river at peak temperatures of 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures like that really can be lethal to wildlife and is far in excess of the limits that are set by many states. And we, I think in the Southeast, we do have more leniency on permitted temperature discharges, which is quite problematic for the ecosystems. 5 of the coal plants on the map, and we'll correct the map for the recording, and folks can go back and zoom in, but there are 5 coal plants in the Southeast. They're colored orange on the map that show that they also experience similar exceedances of safe water temperature returns of cooling water. And 2 of the coal plants in the image had not enough water available. So, and those are the blue coal images when looking back. And at some point during the time frame between 2004 and 2013, these facilities were incapable of using the water to actually cool the facility. Unfortunately, in these instances, the utility either has to buy emergency power off the grid or ramp up another facility. And as I mentioned, that can be quite costly for both the utility, and then those costs are often passed on to bill payers. So let's move on to some examples of water stress at nuclear facilities in the region. This is Duke Energy's McGuire nuclear facility in North Carolina in the summer of 2007 during that severe drought. Lake Norman dropped from 98 feet down to 93 feet. Now that's less than a foot above the minimum needed for the McGuire nuclear station to run its backup systems. And that's a scary situation because the backup systems are what nuclear facilities rely on when something else goes wrong. So essentially in this situation, the extremely low water levels like this reduce the margin of error to very unsafe levels. this is Florida Power and Light's Turkey Point reactors 3 and 4 on this site just this year decreased operations by 90%, and then a second time by 75% due to hot water coming into the facility. So that's 2 times this year when the water temperatures exceeded the allowable safe threshold for this nuclear facility, that is 100 degrees. And this is the Browns Ferry nuclear facility in Alabama, and it had to drastically cut its output 3 times in the last 6 summers. So in 2007, 2010, and 2011, including one time for 5 consecutive weeks in the summer of 2010 because the hot weather made the Tennessee River so warm that the plant also could not use it for cooling. There are other examples. We have a new set of nuclear units in the works by Southern Company in Georgia at Plant Vogtle, and those new reactors are expected to need upwards of 62 million gallons a day for cooling. That's in addition to the 127 million gallons a day that the existing reactors can use. And most of that water doesn't get returned to the river. An estimated 71 to 88% evaporates into the atmosphere. By comparison, the city of Savannah withdraws 55 million gallons a day for drinking water. So you can see this facility is a much bigger consumer than people are. Although obviously we are the consumers of the electricity, which consumes water. And last example from Alabama, several years ago, Plant Farley, a nuclear facility that is also owned by Southern Nuclear, had to reduce its generation level and actually bring in additional portable cooling units because of significantly reduced water levels on the Chattahoochee River. So I also wanted to mention that tornadoes are of concern for us here in the Southeast. You know, the linkage between climate change and tornadoes is still out. It's probably about where the scientific community was about 10 years ago on the linkage between hurricanes and climate change. We probably will see that developing over time, but regardless of the linkage, tornadoes are an extreme weather event that particularly affect the Southeast and also draw the attention and need for us to make sure that our energy sector is resilient to those concerns. Yeah, and if you click one more to get, and one more, and one, sorry, maybe, yeah, that's it. Sorry, I didn't realize. So this is a set of charts here that refer back to the other report that Steve was mentioning that UCS released last year, talking about how water consumption and water withdrawals can be significantly decreased by investments in renewable energy. So this is just another way that you can see the black line is essentially, you know, business as usual, but if we aggressively invest in renewable energy, we can drop water consumption rapidly to as much as 85 and 97% of today's usage. And Steve mentioned how resilient wind turbines can be in the face of hurricanes. If you visit SACE's Footprints blog, you'll find a new posting this week about how Hawaii's wind farms weathered the recent 2 hurricanes extremely well. We can provide that link for folks if necessary. But at this point, I'd like to conclude and open it up for question and answers. And thank you all very much for your time today. And Steve, we do have a number of questions that have already rolled in. Okay, so let me read the first question that we received. The speaker, so the question is, and this was for you, Steve, and I'm trying to make sure I'm understanding the question. So the speaker said that I think 1 degree rise in temperature would result in 12% reduction in something, and the asker is wondering if they heard that right. If if that's correct, is this 12% just due to transmission loss of efficiency, or does it factor in warmer water used for cooling?
Yeah, I can address that, thanks. And my apologies, I don't think I stated it very clearly when I was saying it. Basically, you know, I was talking about the impact of droughts and heat waves and how they can reduce efficiency, and that, you know, that can come both from higher air temperatures and higher water temperatures, which obviously are linked. The particular stat that he was confused by was related to actually increases in water temperatures of between 1.3 and 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit higher than today by mid-century. And there was a study that was done on that that showed that those increases in water temperatures could result in limits on water discharge temperatures, which could cause a 12 to 16% loss in power plant capacity on average. So it was water temperatures really that were driving that.
Great, thanks. Okay, the second question, speaking of coal supply line challenges from flooding and other things, how much or how long of a supply of coal do power plants usually keep on hand?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure the precise answer to that question. I think it varies a little bit, but kind of what I've heard is, you know, plants could keep up to like a 30-day supply of coal at the power plant. But I have heard and I have seen some coverage of this where some plants have reduced their supplies and have had trouble getting deliveries, whether that's, I'm not entirely sure it's really from extreme weather or climate change of what's limited those deliveries, but other constraints. The rail and delivery system often can cause that. And some plants have had diminished supplies at their plants, you know, from, you know, even just a couple of days supply, that in some cases has allowed some coal plants to ramp down their production just because of the uncertainty about whether they, you know, will have enough, or at least to keep the plants running for a longer period of time until they can get more supply.
Great, thanks, Steve. The next question is, are there ways to quantify cost savings from resilience building clean energy solutions so that those numbers could be incorporated into the cost and value models for utility planning?
That is an excellent question. You know, the types of things that I talked about, like the Entergy study in 2011, there's also been some studies done more by, you know, states or cities that tried to look at some of those issues. And so I think there are ways to do it, but, you know, I'm not sure how easy it is to do. I mean, I think typically what they're looking at is, you know, by adopting these improvements, you know, what losses could be avoided, but also, you know, looking at particularly things for like energy efficiency that can help actually reduce utility bills. That's just a no-brainer. I mean, that's something that is a saving. So, you know, those types of things can be done independently, but utilities still are not really doing a very good job of that. I think the other problem is that, you know, clearly climate change is a global phenomenon. So what any individual utility does, you know, may or may not impact the problem. It's really going to require everybody to do it. But that said, utilities are really doing quite a poor job of just planning for the changes that are underway and planning for what those costs could be, which in most cases, either the cost of climate change or the cost of adapting to them are far higher than things they could do to reduce the impacts.
Great. The next question is, besides efficiency and renewables, what are the prospects for developing solutions to change the grid to distributed energy? And I think that question may have come in before you talked about the smart grid ideas, but if you have anything to add.
There's a lot of discussion going on around this right now with respect, especially with respect to the dramatic increase we've been seeing with rooftop solar and distributed solar, as well as, you know, the increase in efficiency that's going on in many parts of the country. And, you know, there's a lot of initiatives underway looking at kind of microgrids and smart grids. There's also lots of discussion about sort of more fundamental changes to the utility business model. One recent proposal or article that just came out a couple of days ago from John Wellinghoff, who was the former chair of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, was proposing kind of a dramatic change to something that would essentially separate out the operation of the distribution system into sort of a regional independent system operator in a similar way to what we have for regional transmission organizations, so that you could align the incentives for utilities to invest in the right things, as opposed to the current incentives are really lined up for utilities to sell more electricity and to put large capital investments in the rate base so they can make a return on that investment. You know, like the Vogel project is a perfect example of that. So really, you know, those incentives do not line up well with the increase in distributed generation. And so, you know, there's one model that's trying to implement sort of what Commissioner Wellinghoff was talking about is in New York. They kind of have a proposal to do kind of a fundamental change to the utility business model along these lines.
And Steve, somebody is asking in relation to the question that you just answered, how can folks get information on John Wellinghoff's ideas that you just mentioned?
The article that I was talking about was published in Public Utilities Fortnightly. I might be able to send that around. I'm not sure if it's publicly available, because I think you have to have a subscription, but I will look into that and see if I can do that. I definitely have the link to it.
Okay, great. Another question is if you have any thoughts on when will battery storage for solar power be available, and will that be available for individual homeowners?
Availability, I mean, it does exist. It's more of an economic issue than anything else. You know, we've seen the cost of solar come way down. The cost of batteries is also coming down, especially with some of the recent announcements, like the Tesla's announcement to build a gigafactory to produce lithium-ion batteries for vehicles, but could also be used for other applications as well. And so it's really more of a question of at what point can you get the cost down low enough that can make it a viable option. And there are a few studies out there. I know the Rocky Mountain Institute did one that looked at this issue. The other one that I've heard of, I can't remember exactly who did it, but I can send that to Stace if you're going to post some of these things that so people can look at. Actually, I think in our power failure report, we also have a couple of references, so you could look at that.
And the power failure report is available on UCS's website at ucsa.org.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Somebody is asking for clarification of the distinction in water consumption of different types, once through and recirculating at coal and nuclear facilities. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, I'll try to. So there's 3 or 4 kind of different kinds of cooling systems that are out there. In the eastern half of the country, there's a lot of once-through cooling, which essentially withdraws large quantities of water from the water body, whether it be a river or a lake or whatever, and uses that water for cooling and then returns most of it back to the water body at a higher temperature. In the West, and there are recirculating systems in the East too, but they're more prevalent in the West where water supplies are limited. And what happens with a recirculating system is that you withdraw much less water into the system, but then it gets reused before it gets reused within the plant before it's returned to the water body. So it results in more evaporative losses and more water is consumed because of that. There's also cooling technologies like dry cooling, which is being used in the West, which essentially uses air instead of water to cool the plant. And those cooling systems are much less, reduce the efficiency of the power plant considerably. So it adds a cost as well, but that is being pursued in regions that have limited water supplies. There have been some standards, some cooling water standards proposed before EPA that I'm not exactly sure what the status of them right now. Ula might know, but they're designed sort of to encourage people to use recirculating cooling over once through, and it's a big capital investment to change out a plant, but it would also have some benefits in terms of reducing some of the impacts to aquatic species that fish and other things that are killed in once-through cooling systems. So yeah. That's just kind of a brain dump on that.
Thanks, Steve. And the rule that you're talking about, I think, is the 316B water rule, and that I think that is mostly oriented toward fish entrapment, wildlife concerns at facilities, maybe not as much as water consumption concerns. But that rule is finalized, and utilities are in the process of working with states to respond to it. My understanding is it was not as protective of the environment as many folks had hoped that rule would come out to be, and puts a lot of responsibility on the states to be enforcers of that particular issue.
One other quick thing to mention too is the question is, what is the difference in water consumption for different types of systems? There's a graph not in power failure, but it's in our water report that kind of compare different technologies for water consumption and water withdrawals that come from some comprehensive research that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has done. So that's a place you could go to look at that, how that compares.
Okay, great, thanks. Just a few more questions, and then we'll probably wrap up here. Are there any incentives in place for energy companies to prepare for climate change? And I think the answer is pretty much no, but I'll let you take a stab at that.
Incentives. Well, I think I'm not sure I'd call them incentives, but there are some initiatives underway. They may not necessarily be targeted at utilities, but some states and some cities have put together so-called resilience funds or they're basically climate adaptation funding, but some states have gone a little bit further and are providing some money not just for hardening and adaptation, but also for clean energy. For example, in Massachusetts, Governor Patrick has an initiative that he announced, I think it was late last year, to spend $40 million into a fund that would go to putting solar PV systems on people's roofs and stuff like that. But so that's one approach that's being adopted. I mean, I think in certain states, commissions require utilities to include a cost for carbon or a value for carbon emissions, so that does provide some incentive to go with lower carbon options. You know, in some parts of the country, like the Northeast and New England, where they have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, there's actually a price on carbon to reduce emissions, so that doesn't provide incentives for the utility industry as well, along with, you know, state policies for energy efficiency and renewables sort of indirectly can help in that way as well.
Great, thanks. Okay, let's see. Maybe one more question here. The number of transformers and power poles lost in Sandy is astounding. Does this mean that most utilities will need a significantly deeper inventory of these and other pieces of equipment?
Well, that's a very good question. Inventory is one way to go about that. Another way to go about it is to, you know, relocate. There's been a lot of utilities, like in New Jersey, for example, in New York, where they've tried to move transformers and substations. There's lots of efforts to put power lines underground, which is generally makes them less vulnerable, but raises other problems. And so, you know, to the extent that you're putting them underground, you don't need the poles anymore, but some of those systems have been vulnerable to flooding, and if other problems happen in lines that are underground, it's just a lot more expensive both to fix the problem and to identify it as well. It can be challenging. So, you know, there's trade-offs with all these things. So, you know, utilities are spending a lot of money to figure out how they can, you know, put some redundancy in their systems and adopt strategies like the ones I talked about to help reduce the impact of outages.
Great. Okay, and actually, let's do one more question to end on. I think this might be an interesting one. If we took a clean slate approach to grid redesign, how would it look given today's technologies?
Well, I think if one could answer that question, you might be very rich. But I think part of the issue is I mentioned this proposal from Wellinghoff, which is interesting in the sense that there's been a lot of controversy around things like net metering and distributed solar, and his approach really kind of turns things on its head and says that's really not the right way to look at it. The more appropriate way to look at it is, you know, what should be the objectives of how the grid operates and what we want utilities to do. And one of those objectives could be reducing emissions. And so, you know, the thing that he's proposing will not be easy to implement in the sense that the distribution system is largely regulated by state utility commissions. So to implement that, you know, on a widespread basis nationally is going to be challenging. But that said, you know, if there's a few states that could sort of go down this path to try it out, like what New York is doing, for example. I think California is considering some things because they have a pretty high penetration of solar. So I think there's some ways to develop some sort of case study approaches and demonstrations that could help see what the benefits of that would be. But we're a ways off from that right now.
Indeed. Great. Well, I think it's time to wrap up. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I hope that people got a lot out of this conversation. Obviously, there are many issues that our organization and Union of Concerned Scientists work on related to other concerns about coal and nuclear plants and the need for more renewable energy and energy efficiency on our system. And we think that talking about climate resilience and resilience in general is yet another opportunity for us to recognize the benefits of diversifying and increasing clean energy in our region. So thank you, and Erin will wrap us up then.
Thanks, Gula, and thanks, Steve, and thank you everyone for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions. For more information, you can please check out our website, cleanenergy.org, and today's presentation has been recorded and will be available on the webinar archive page of our website. We will be sending a link to that recording once it's been processed, so you'll receive that in the follow-up email in a few days. We appreciate your support and interest and hope that you'll join us again. Thanks.